Hey, good morning. Welcome to Shiloh Christian Church. Thanks to all of you for joining us this morning. For some of you, if you are joining us for the first week ever on the heels of Easter, you were with us last week. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being a part of this. Our goal as a church is to multiply. It's to reach people with the love of Jesus. It's to reach people, to bring them into a community. And our church exists for three things: to build faith, to restore hope, and to show love. Everything that we do comes out of these three purposes, out of these three missions. And I want to ask all of you to be a part of that. For so many over the last few years, it's become easier and easier to distance ourselves from the church. And maybe for you, you've been watching online for a long time. But I want to invite you into something deeper and truly into something better. I want to invite you into the body of Christ. Our goal as a church, as we gather around Northern Colorado and home churches this morning, is to multiply these home churches, to continue to reach people, to continue to grow these churches, to continue to grow in that community, to continue to be the church here in Northern Colorado. Regardless of where you are at this morning, or regardless of what brings you here, I am thankful for this time. I believe that this Sunday, the message time this morning, 1 week removed from Easter, will challenge you. But I want to continue to challenge you to not just watch from afar, but to come into the community, to be a part of the church, to strengthen others, and to allow yourself to be strengthened by others as well. Thank you for being here this morning, and I pray that this time blesses you. Hey, good morning, everybody. Welcome to a Sunday morning here at Shiloh Christian Church. It has been a few weeks since we have been gathered together like this. We had Easter last weekend, worship the weekend before. And so for many of us, it's been a few weeks since we have been gathered in our homes, gathered as the church as we are this morning. And so for many of you, maybe you have missed this time of getting together with everybody. Maybe for some of you, you just haven't seen some of these faces in a while. Maybe for some of you, you're like, it's good to be with some of you. And for some others, maybe you're like, it's been so good not seeing you every week. But regardless of where you are at, it's an exciting morning. It's great to be together. It's great to be gathered. For those of you in our host homes this morning, thank you for coming together. Thank you for being a part of the church, the body gathered this morning. Last Sunday, Easter Sunday, was an exciting Sunday for all of us. Easter Sunday, specifically just has this buzz about it. It's always an exciting day. It brings people who maybe we haven't seen in a while. You have people who are willing to come to church who maybe aren't otherwise willing to come to church. You have the hearts of all of us that maybe listen a little bit more than we usually do. You kind of have an idea of what the message is going to be about. You kind of have an idea of the theme or the focus of worship. And last Sunday was exciting. It was so fun to see, for those of you who showed up early, how many people were gathered upstairs, hanging outside on the porch, enjoying some coffee, socializing with everyone, being together, laughing, and just to hear that, to see that, filled my cup, and I know it filled the cup for so many of you as well. One of the things that I love about Easter Sunday is that so many people come together to serve. And last Sunday was no exception. There were so many of you who asked, hey, how can I help? There were so many of you who got to fill some of these roles, who got to serve, who got to set up, who helped Tiffany in the children's ministry, who helped upstairs with setup or with security or whatever it may be. And for all of you who helped, for all of you who served, for all of you who sacrificed, for all of you who came Saturday before everyone showed up on Sunday, thank you guys. Thank you for being a part of the church. Thank you for promoting the church. Thank you for loving and for serving the church. And thank you for making last Sunday what it was. One of the things that is also exciting about Sundays is just the renewed sense of hope. Again, not just on these Sundays, on like your average normal Sunday, but specifically on Easter Sunday. There is a hope that we have on Easter Sunday, because while we know that there will be battles that we fight here on earth, We know that the war has been won. When Jesus walked out of the tomb, something that we forget about probably more than we remember is that death was defeated. Satan was defeated. Satan was put on notice that his game was over. And so all he has left now is to bring about as much destruction as he can until the return of Jesus, because he knows that at that time, it's over. Whether it's demon or whether it's Satan, evil has always known its place in regards to eternity and in regards to the presence of a king. And so last Sunday we have this sense of hope and knowing that because Jesus came out of the tomb, we win the war. And so we suffer for much of the year. We suffer throughout life just with the pains of being humans, the disappointments, the discouragements, the depression, all of these things that come with being human. But we know that the end is written. We know that the end of the book has been written, and we have read it and we have access to it. And Jesus walked out of a tomb that had claimed him, a tomb that had held him. And Jesus walked out with a crown. He walked out victorious. And because of that, as heirs to the throne, we live in that victory today. And we got to celebrate it last Sunday. So while we have this hype, while we have the excitement of Easter Sunday, as all of us experienced, Monday comes. And for all of us, we had to go back to work this week. We had to go back to school this week. We had to get back to the schedules. We had to take kids to their sporting events. We had all of these things called life that we had to go back to. And so Summit or Easter is like the summit. It's the pinnacle. It's the mountaintop. You know, it is the greatest part of Christianity. And then Easter ends and we kind of start this like descent back into the valleys of life as we continue on this journey. There is a sense of disappointment. There is a kind of this letdown. It's that like Christmas morning after all of the gifts have been opened type of feeling where you're like, what now? You know, like we celebrated this, it was great, and what now? Like we have to play with the gifts, we have to eat the candy, we have to chew on these peeps, like Easter is over. And so there's this natural progression to leave the summit. We're not the first ones to feel that. However, if you were to put yourselves in the shoes of the disciples or the sandals of the disciples 2,000 years ago when Jesus resurrected, I want you to try to imagine what Easter weekend that they didn't know was Easter, resurrection weekend. I want you to imagine what life was like for the weeks that followed. For the disciples who saw their king murdered and hung on a cross, when Jesus walks out of the tomb and begins coming to them and talking with them and engaging with them, there was something that they experienced that we could not explain or understand this morning. I remember, this is probably a terrible analogy, but I remember one time when I was a kid in like middle school going to Excalibur in Las Vegas on a stopover to California. And I remember this magician one time who was just roaming the halls of the Excalibur. He walked up to me and he was like, hey, do you want to see this trick? And he holds out a hand in front of me with a deck of cards. And he puts his hand over like this and he raises his hand and the top card on the deck elevated. And being like a middle school student, I was just like, what on earth am I seeing? Like there's no strings attached, there's nothing there. And this card is elevating off of this deck. It was the coolest magic trick I'd ever seen. The resurrection of Jesus probably felt for everybody who saw him, the thousands of people who saw the resurrected Jesus, they probably felt the sense of awe that I felt as a kid when I saw this card lifted off of this deck. You have to imagine that if you were just the normal person, like you saw the crowds gathered, you never talked to Jesus personally, but you saw what they were saying about him, what they were doing to him. You heard his screams as he was being beaten. You saw him bleeding. You saw him walking up the hill carrying a cross. You saw him crucified. You saw a spear driven through his side. You saw this people, the Roman soldiers who were beating and battering this man and putting nails through his wrists and his feet, and you saw him elevated on the cross. Imagine if you were that person, and after the resurrection of Jesus, you're walking down the road, you see this group of men coming, and in the middle of these men is that man, Jesus, who you had just saw crucified. And as they walk by, Jesus looks over and he makes eye contact with you and he smiles and you're just like, what the heck? Like, that's the guy. That was the man who was crucified. And so there was this buzz that filled Jerusalem. There was this buzz that filled the whole area as everybody was talking. Did you see Jesus? That man who was crucified has been resurrected. I saw him with my own eyes walking through the streets. I saw him with my own eyes with the disciples. I have seen him. I heard him speak. I could see the scabs on his head from this crown of thorns. You can still see the holes in his hand. They're still healing. There's this hole in his side from the spear. Like, I saw it. I want you to imagine what it would have been like to be walking through Jerusalem as the resurrected Jesus walked through the streets with you. There was something crazy, something electrifying going on, and it was the only thing that people are talking about. But as we know, a few weeks later, that buzz began to fade. The electricity wasn't so pronounced, the noise not so loud. For the disciples, for everybody who had seen the resurrected Jesus over the course of the few weeks following his resurrection, the light began to fade a little bit. And they began to feel what many of us are feeling now, like the hype is over, and now what? And now what do we do? What I want to do this morning, before I hop into a new series, which I've pushed to next week, is I just want to pause. I don't want to leave the resurrection of Jesus. I don't want to leave what took place on that Sunday. I don't want to leave the celebration of Easter. And what I want to do is look at one chapter together as the church this morning, the last chapter in John 21, the last chapter of the Gospels. It is the last chapter between the resurrection of Jesus, which was John 20, and the end of the Gospels. And you have John 21, in which the disciples find themselves in this place where we are today, where we're like, now what? What does this mean for us? What I want to do today as the church is I want to read John 21 together, the whole chapter in its entirety. And as I read it this week, there's some things that I pulled from it. 5 of them, I think that as we read through this morning, that you will see, you will pull, you'll understand. But 2 that probably many of you, most of you will not know and you would skip right over. And what I want to do this morning is I want to pause. I want to again focus on the resurrection of Jesus. And I want to look at what it means for you and I today. The purpose of these Sundays, the purpose of the church is not just this transfer of information, it's this transformation of life. What takes place in John 21 has the opportunity to transform our lives if we allow it. So all of you, open up your Bibles, open to John chapter 21, and we will go through this together. John chapter 21, beginning in verse 1. It says, afterward, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, also known as Didymus, this is doubting Thomas, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, two other disciples were together. I'm going out to fish, Simon Peter told them. And they said, we will go with you. So they went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. He called out to them, friends, haven't you any fish? No, they answered. He said, throw your net on the right side of the boat and you will find some. And when they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved, this is John, said to Peter, it is the Lord. As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, it is the Lord, he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and he jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from shore, about 100 yards. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it and some bread. It's going to be a very important verse in just a minute. Verse 10, Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish that you have just caught. So Simon Peter climbed back into the boat and dragged the net ashore. It was full of large fish, 153. But even with so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, come and have breakfast. None of the disciples dared ask him, who are you? They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came, took the bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the third time that Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said, "you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. And then he said to him, "Follow me." Peter turned and saw that the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. This was the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the supper and had said, "Lord, who is going to betray you?" When Peter saw him, he asked, "Lord, what about him?" Jesus answered, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me." Because of this, the rumor spread among the believers that this disciple would not die. But Jesus did not say that he would not die. He only said, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you?" This is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true. Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written. With the conclusion of John 21 comes the conclusion of the Gospels. In this chapter, you have, towards the end here, as Jesus is explaining to Peter that you will go somewhere when you are old that you do not want to go. Somebody else will dress you. They will stretch out your arms. He's indicating to Peter that Peter would be crucified. Imagine if Jesus showed up today in our church and was like, "Hey, you're going to die by crucifixion." That would change your life a little bit, wouldn't it? So Jesus is telling Peter, he says, your arms are going to be stretched out. You are going to be crucified. And for those of you that know the story of Peter, Peter was indeed crucified, but he could not stand to be crucified the way that Jesus had been crucified. And so Peter requested that he be crucified upside down. And so he was crucified on a cross. But instead of it being lifted up the way that every other cross was lifted up, Peter was crucified upside down for his faith. As you read John 21, there are these things, as I mentioned, that stand out. These things that we must know. These things that we must hold on to. I have certainly grown to believe this, and I want to ask all of you to believe this as well. When we open Scripture, knowing that the Word of God is living and active, we will learn more, we will grow more, we will hold on to more when we write it down. And what I want to do this morning is ask all of you to open up your phone, to open up your notes app, to open up a piece of paper, grab a pen or a pencil, and I want you to take some notes. And not just today, but every single time that the Bible is opened, because we know that when we take notes, when we are listening, when we are writing things down, that we will retain more of what we hear. And this morning is no exception. Again, the purpose of this is not simply to relay information. It's to look at Scripture and be transformed by the living and active words of God. As you look at John 21, there are 7 things that I want to point out. I've put some questions with some of them. I've put some statements with some of them. And I don't want this to be like the typical message format. I want to look at John 21 with you, gathered as the church, and ask, what does it mean for our lives? So 7 things from John 21. Number 1, first thing to note is that even after the resurrection, Jesus is still present. Even after the resurrection, Jesus is still present. And he is still present here today. Do you believe that? This is a profound question that you must answer. Do you believe that Jesus is still present today? For the disciples, after the resurrection of Jesus, you have the men who are gathered together and they've seen Jesus now a couple of times, but they're not with him. Like the resurrected Jesus is walking around somewhere and the disciples are not with him. It was like they were living as though Jesus was somewhere else. But even after the resurrection, even after Easter Sunday has faded, Jesus was still present. He was still with them, and he is still present and with us today. Matthew 18:20. This was Jesus speaking. Hear these words. Jesus says, "Where two or more are gathered in my name, there I am with them." Where two or more are gathered in my name, there I am. For Jesus to say two or more is a pretty significant statement because yes, Jesus is with us. Yes, his Spirit lives within us. For the Christian who has given his life to Christ, yes, they carry the Spirit of God. But Jesus makes a point to say that I am not with everybody at all times. He says, where two or more are gathered, there I am. Which means that when we are gathered as we are this morning, as the church, Jesus is present. I want you to think about that this morning. For those of you gathered as the church, Jesus is with you. He is in your midst. He is in the room where two or more are gathered in my name. Like we are this morning. I am there. For all of you gathered as the church this morning, Jesus is in your presence. He can see you. He can hear you. It's the promise that he gives us in Matthew 18 is that he will be with us. That will probably change, if you could picture Jesus, if you could see Jesus there, that would probably change worship a little bit. It would change your engagement. It would change what you were thinking about. It would change the Twitter feed or the Instagram feed that you're checking. It would change how many times you get up to go to the bathroom if Jesus is sitting there in your presence. And the promise of Jesus is that he is here with us this morning, and we cannot forget that. The second thing, just as the disciples did, all of us will battle with seasons of discouragement and doubt. Just as the disciples did, all of us will battle with seasons of discouragement and doubt. For the disciples, as they are gathered together and Jesus is off doing something, what does Peter do? He's like, dude, I got to get out of here. Like, I'm going to go fish. And you have the other disciples who are sitting there. Nobody really knows what to do, but they're like, we're going with you. We don't know how to make sense of all this. We don't know what the heck is next. We don't know what we're doing, but we're going to go. And so Peter's like, I just got to go do this thing, this thing that I know. All of us have these things. When life is difficult, when things are hard, we have these things that we go do. For some of you, you go fishing. For some of you, maybe you go sit at a coffee shop. For some of you, maybe you go read a book. But Peter's like, I got to go. Like, I'm wrestling with this. I am discouraged. I am doubting. When Jesus meets the disciples on the mountain after his resurrection, it says that they worshiped him, but some doubted. You have Thomas, who his closest friends are all like, dude, we have seen Jesus. We saw him. We spoke with him. And Thomas is like, I can't get there. Like, I want to believe it and I can't get there. You have Thomas who doubted until he saw Jesus. And he says, my Lord and my God. You have Peter and the disciples who are fighting through discouragement. And just as the disciples did, you and I today will battle through seasons of discouragement and we will battle through seasons of doubt. And it's okay. It is okay to be discouraged. It is okay to doubt. For those who look to Jesus, he provides them with everything that they need. And when we struggle today, we find everything that we need. All of the hope, all of the joy that we need found in Jesus. Discouragement and doubt are okay places to be, but they are not okay places to stay. Doubt and discouragement, you will find yourselves in those places along the journey of life, and they are okay places to be, but they are not okay places to stay. This morning, if you are battling through discouragement, if you are battling through doubt, do not sit, do not stay, but get up and fight to get out of that place. Number 3, the disciples went back to doing what they had done before, unsure about what to do with the resurrection. Let me ask you this. What does the resurrection of Jesus mean to you today? What does the resurrection of Jesus mean to you today? I know what it meant to you last Sunday, but what does it mean to you today? I'll tell you this, if you cannot clearly and powerfully state the significance of the resurrection of Jesus in your own life today, you should spend some time doing that. You should spend some time writing down the significance of the resurrection of Jesus and what it means for your life today. For the disciples, as they sat in this room battling through that, trying to make sense of it, they weren't sure what to do with it. They didn't know what the next step was, and so they went out. They went to do this thing. They went fishing. And take note of who meets them in that place. Take note of who meets them while they are out doing what they had always done before they had met Jesus. Jesus, again, does not sit there and wait for them to come back, much like Easter, much like what we talked about last week. Jesus goes to them and he meets them where they are. If you're struggling through doubt, if you're struggling through discouragement, it's okay, but do not stay in that place. Number 4 is the disciples didn't recognize Jesus because they weren't looking for him. As the disciples are out in the boat fishing and Jesus calls out to them and he says, "Friends, have you caught any fish?" The disciples hear the voice of Jesus. They turn and they look at Jesus, but they do not recognize Jesus because they were not looking for him. So let me ask you this. Is it possible that Jesus has been trying to get your attention, speaking to you and calling to you this morning, and you have failed to recognize it because you are not looking for him? Is it possible that you have not been listening to him and yet he has been speaking to you this whole time? For some of you this morning, you sit in this place with your hands over your ears and your eyes closed and you're like, I don't see Jesus and I don't hear Jesus and he's absent. And I will tell you this, that it's probably because you have not been looking for him and you have not been listening for him. I have seen Jesus more in the last 2 months than I have in the last 3 years. And I've been desperately seeking for him. I've been listening and hearing him more in the last 2 months than I have in the last 3 years, and I have not stopped listening for him. For some of you this morning, you need to open your eyes. You need to open your ears. You need to hear the voice of God calling to you, and you need to see what it is that he is calling you to do. Number 5, this is one of my favorite parts from John 21. In John 21, you have Jesus who builds this fire. In John 21:9, it says that Jesus on the shore has a fire of burning coals. This word that is used in the Greek that describes this fire of burning coals is only used twice in all of the New Testament. Anthrokia is the word. Anthrokia. It is a fire of burning coals. So Jesus calls to the disciples. He says, hey, come in here. They've just caught this net full of fish. Peter realizes who it is. He's swimming to him. And it's significant that Jesus is on the shore with this fire of burning coals. The word that is used there is used 3 chapters previous. It's the only other time it's used in the New Testament, in John 18:18. In John 18:18, this is right as Jesus is being taken in to be tried. You have Peter and John who have followed him in. Peter's just cut off the ear of the servant. They follow him in. And in John 18, Peter is waiting outside of the gates as Jesus is being tried. And he gathers around a fire with a group of individuals. And it says this in John 18:18. It says it was cold, and the servants and officials stood around a coal fire that they had made to stay warm. In John 18:18, as Peter stands around this fire, many of you know what happens at this fire. Why Peter stands around this fire of coals, he denies Jesus 3 times. This thing that Jesus had told him he would do, that Peter said, I will never deny you. Peter goes, he stands around this fire of coals, and he denies Jesus 3 times right there. As Peter's gathered around this fire, the smell of coals, the smell of the smoke, Peter's gathered around this fire, and it is in that place that he denies Jesus 3 times. And then Jesus is crucified. And then Jesus is resurrected. And Peter can't make sense of it, and he's in this boat, and Jesus calls to him, and Peter swims in, and what is it that Jesus is sitting at? A fire of coals. That's not a coincidence, and it's not an accident that those are the only 2 times that this Greek word is used. Jesus knew that he was doing Imagine being Peter as you swim up out of the lake and you're soaked and you're wet and you run up on this fire and you smell the smoke that you smelled days before at the betrayal of Jesus, the greatest mistake that you have ever made in your life. Imagine being Peter, and as he runs up to Jesus, Jesus is looking at him and he's made this fire, and there's this unspoken communication where Peter recognizes through the smell, he's like, no, don't take me back to this place. This is where I was standing when I betrayed you 3 times. Jesus knew that. Jesus made this fire of coals, and he was bringing Peter back to this place where once it had been a place of betrayal, and now it would become a place of healing. It's anthrokia. It's a fire of coals. And as Jesus brings Peter back to this place, he's letting Peter know, I know of your mistakes. I know what has happened. I know what you did. I know that you did the thing that you swore to me that you would not do. And as Peter and Jesus share this moment on the beach before all the other disciples get in with the boat and the fish, Jesus meets Peter at his place of betrayal. And he tells him, through words unspoken, Peter, I know what happened. I know what you did. And yet, here I am. It's this incredible example of Jesus reminding Peter that in spite of your failures, I still love you. It's this incredible reminder to a man who was hard, to a man that swore he would never betray Jesus, that he would never do this thing that Jesus said he would do. It was this reminder to a broken and empty shell of a man that he was still loved by his King. For Peter, as he stood there smelling the smoke of denial, smelling the smoke of sin, smelling the smoke of the thing he hated the most about himself, Jesus meets him there. And he reminds Peter that I love you. There's nowhere else in the New Testament that these words are used except at the betrayal of Peter, as Peter denies Jesus, and at this resurrection of sorts for Peter's heart, as he is reminded that he is loved by Jesus. You see, what Jesus does with Peter is what he does with all of us. He meets us in these places of regret. He meets us in our failures and our faults and our desire to quit and our desire to walk away and our desire to do something else when we just go back to what we've always known because we don't know what to do with Jesus. Jesus meets us there. In spite of our failures, acknowledging our failures, he reminds us that we are loved. And I cannot imagine the heartache of Peter as he sat there with Jesus. And Jesus is reminding him through the smell of this fire of what has happened. And Peter is overwhelmed in this empty place in his soul, is filled again by the love of Jesus. For so many of us, we need to stop living in the boat. We need to stop going back to the thing that provides just this sense of escape. And we need to come back to Jesus and be reminded that we are loved. And if you listen, and if you are looking, Jesus will call you back to that place. And he will speak those words of life to you. Number 6, notice that the blessings for the disciples came through obedience to Jesus. The blessings for the disciples came through their obedience to Jesus. They have fished all night with their nets on the left side, and Jesus shows up and he's like, hey, throw your nets on the other side of the boat. And if you are thinking logically, that makes absolutely no sense because fish swim, fish move. The difference between the left side of the boat and the right side of the boat is like, 10 feet maybe. We've been here all night. What difference does it make if I do this when we have already decided to do this? The difference is obedience. What difference does it make to not be baptized because I love God, to be baptized when I know that you say that? What difference does it make? Does it matter? It's called obedience. What difference does it make if I live a certain way because this is who I am and I know that Jesus has called me to live this way and it's not that big of a difference. I'm not murdering anybody. I'm not doing these terrible things. So what difference does it make if I move from this to this? The difference is obedience. There's 100,000 ways that we could put this, but blessings come through obedience. And for the disciples, they picked these nets up, they drug them up, They brought him into the boat. They cast him over on the other side 10 feet away, and they are met with the biggest catch of their career, 153 fish. So interesting that the number is actually used. Not only do they have the biggest catch of their careers, but the nets don't break, which makes absolutely no sense because the nets should have broke. You see the provision, the blessing, the abundance came through obedience. They could have left their nets over here. They could have continued to fish the way that they had been fishing and live the way that they had continued to live and not bothered with what seems like this marginal level of obedience, and they never would have experienced the blessing. But blessing comes through obedience. For some of you, you are living this on this line. You are just on the other side of disobedience, and you know that God has called you to the other side, but you're like, I'm close enough. I'm close enough to the fence. I'm close enough to the line. This should work. And you will never experience the blessing and the provision and the abundance of God until you step over in obedience. If God has told you to stop doing this, then you need to stop doing this. If God has told you to walk away from this, then you need to walk away from this. If God has told you to leave this behind, then you leave this behind and you step across to the other side and you live in obedience, because that is where you experience the blessings. For some of you, you are so consumed with trying to provide for yourself. You're so lost in your careers. You're so lost in your choices, trying to make it happen under your own strength. And you're fishing on the left side of the boat, and God has called you to the right. And you're like, I don't have time to do all this. I don't have time to bring in my nets. I need to fully invest in this. I need to provide. I need to be invested. And so I say no to everything else. I say no to friendships, and some of you are being lousy friends. And you say no to your family, and some of you are being lousy fathers or mothers. And some of you say no to all of these things because you are so entrenched in fishing on the left side of the boat when God has called you to the right side of the boat so that you can be a better friend, so that you can be a better parent, so that you can be a better disciple. And it will not be until you switch to the other side of the boat that you encounter the blessings and the abundance and the provision of God, provided by God, simply found through obedience, not through your own hard work. Some of you this morning need to hear that. You need to reel your nets in. You need to cast them on the other side. The final thing, number 7, is this. We are called to continually grow in our love for God. This is one of these things that probably most of you would miss, and you would cross right over, and this section won't even make sense to you until now. When Jesus begins questioning Peter, he says, Peter, do you love me? And Peter's like, yes, Lord, I love you. Jesus is like, Peter, do you love me? He's like, yes, Lord, I love you. Jesus is like, Peter, do you love me? And Peter's like, for God's sakes, yes, I love you. You know all things. Literally, you are God. You know that I love you. And Peter's hurt by it. But things get lost in the English vocab here. You see, in Greek, in this word love that we use, there's 3 different definitions, literally 3 different words for love. The first one is eros, which is this romantic love. It's the love between a husband and a wife. There's a second love, which is phileo, which is this brotherly love. Philadelphia, all these different words that come from phileo. Phileo is this brotherly love, a love shared between Christians. And there's this third love, which is an agape love, which is the love that God has for us. It is this perfect love. It is an unconditional, unwavering, relentless, unextinguishable love. It is this relentless love of God. You see, when Jesus is asking Peter if he loves him, Jesus says, Peter, do you agape me? Like, do you love me with the most profound love? Peter responds, he says, I phileo you, like I brotherly love you. You see, they're not even using the same words. And so Jesus asks him again, he says, Peter, do you agape me? Like, do you really love me? And Peter's like, I phileo you, like I love you like a brother. And so then Jesus comes back the third time and he's like, Peter, like, are we even friends? Peter, do you phileo me? And Peter's like, Jesus, you know that I phileo you. I love you like a brother. What Jesus is asking Peter if we were to put it in simple terms, Jesus says this. He's like, Peter, do you love me? And Peter's like, Lord, you know I love you. And he's like, Peter, do you really love me? And Peter's like, Lord, you know I love you. And then Jesus to Peter's like, Peter, are we even friends? Are we even friends? You see, what Jesus was drawing Peter to was a deeper love for him. For some of us today, we could ask the same question. In fact, I will ask you the same question. Do you love Jesus? Like, do you really love Jesus? Like with your heart, soul, mind, and strength, everything? Or are you even friends with Jesus? See, as Jesus breaks these questions down to Peter, he can break these questions down to us today. Do you love Jesus? And if you say yes, I would say based on what? And I'll say, do you really love Jesus? And if you say yes, I would say based on what? Are you even friends with Jesus? If you say yes, I would say based on what? See, that's what Jesus was asking Peter. It's like, Peter, if you love me, then you will do something. Take care of my sheep. Take care of my sheep. With love, there must be action. Our love is displayed for Jesus and for everybody else through action. So we can have this love for Christ, but he continually calls us to deeper places of love. This morning, a week removed from Easter, what does the resurrection of Jesus mean to you? Do you love Jesus? Do you really love Jesus? Like in this place where you will surrender everything, and like Peter, you will allow your hands to be stretched out on this mantle of sacrifice for your life. Do you really love Jesus? When it is painful, when you are going places that you don't want to go and doing things that you don't want to do, will you live a life of sacrifice? Like, do you really love Jesus? Or are you even friends with him? For us this morning, as you look at John 21, it is a profound chapter. And it's one that forces us to look within our own hearts and our own souls. To ask ourselves, do we love Jesus? To ask ourselves, do we really love Jesus? To ask ourselves, are we friends with Jesus? And like he did with Peter, Jesus gently meets us wherever we are. And he calls us into these deeper places of love. He calls us through our failures and through our sins to these deeper places of knowing him so that we can answer the question, what does the resurrection of Jesus mean to you?
Hana hayau le ahodo dat marlan ina natu mashicha bara de haleha
Anea na.
good far good far good far Muslim.